Gaming as a hobby today isn't the little pastime it was widely considered to be. It is now the most profitable form of media in the world, because not only are games able to outsell movies and books, they are also able to monetize themselves in ways not possible in other mediums. A couple of guys working for a small toy studio in the early 80s could easily make their money back by selling arcade machines because it was a small team, and if the game was good, lots of people would buy the machine, but that's just not doable anymore. Now, games are expensive. Games are more expensive than they have ever been, and not just for us, the consumers, but for developers and publishers as well. These products now require hundreds of skilled people, upwards of 5 years of development time to make something that has to sell multiple millions of units in order to be successful, and that starts to add up really fast, which is why the microtransaction has taken over. Games have had them from the very start, but they look very different from how they used to. All it takes to buy a microtransaction now on your phone or console is a simple input of your credit card number, and boom, you have what you want. Never has a payment system been as easy as it used to be in the arcade, where all it took was a quarter being put into a slot. There isn't a middleman, just instant gratification to get what you want. In recent years, we've seen microtransactions turn into this infection that plagues the industry in a way that I don't think will ever be reversible. It has been introduced into the system and is now part of it, and it is the one thing killing the industry. So how did we get here? How did gaming microtransactions move away from being so small into being not so micro? How did it turn into a seemingly harmless spend of a few dollars into this malevolent force of nature? Well, stay with me while I go through the history of microtransactions. From the arcades to modern day, let's learn how we got to this point. But before we do, please like and subscribe down below so you can be informed when more gaming essays like this release in the future. It also helps the video spread and lets the discussion keep going. Now, let's dive in. Before we begin in earnest, let me make the definition of a microtransaction as crystal clear as possible. A microtransaction is defined thusly by Cambridge Dictionary, quote, a payment of very small value, especially for a special feature of a product such as a video game, end quote. This is a very nebulous definition, and that's because microtransactions are pretty nebulous things. In the current gaming landscape, the word is used to describe practically anything that one could buy within a game, or even something that adds more content to a game you already have, whether it's premium currency, new cosmetics, weapon unlocks, new characters, a battle pass, you name it, games have it. If we break the word down into its bare essentials, it literally means a transaction using a small amount of money. But who and what determines if a transaction is micro, really? At what point does a transaction become small? Well, I don't think there's an easy answer for that, because the size of a transaction is all relative. What I would consider a microtransaction isn't what you would consider to be one, and yet all of them fall under the same generalized definition. But also, it's important that a microtransaction refers to something strictly game related. Buying a game off a store shelf cannot be considered a microtransaction, because the term refers to something that you have to engage with that already exist. So a game itself isn't one, but buying something in a game would be one. Catch my drift? You wouldn't call buying an ebook a microtransaction, or buying something off of Amazon a microtransaction. It has to add value to a game already in existence, which makes the origins of the term very tricky to decipher when we look back at the origins of gaming as a pastime and hobby. Games didn't always have a way to instantly buy new content for the thing you spend hours and hours on. They used to be products you would just buy, and that was it. You never had to purchase anything else in addition. They were complete products in most cases. When games started to hit the mainstream, they were very similar in that respect, but they were monetized in a very different way. Now, I might say something a bit controversial here, but hear me out. We can see where the very first microtransactions took form, and the origin point for microtransactions would be the arcade, the birthplace of gaming as we know it today. So let me expound on this statement. I know we consider microtransactions today to be these things that add value to the games we already own. By all measures of the word as we know it today, an arcade machine is the textbook definition of a microtransaction, even if the word didn't exist back then. It's a small purchase to an existing game that adds value to your experience. Extra lives, more time on the clock, more chances to get a high score, and so on. The game exists in perpetuity, always waiting for the next customer to slap a quarter into the slot. But how these microtransactions differ from today's loose definition is that these arcade games require an initial investment to play to begin with. Unless machines were set to free play, you were unable to interface with them at all. If you knew how to play an arcade game really well, you could make your purchase last. These machines were known for their absurd levels of difficulty, so making it far into a game with just a single quarter would be considered by many a badge of honor among their peers. And not only that, but other players often had the opportunity to play beside you in co-op games like Gauntlet, Mario Brothers, or one of the many beat-em-ups that line the arcades. It always seemed like a new one was always right around the corner. If we use the logic that arcade games use microtransactions, then they are also some of the very first pay-to-win games on the market, especially beat-em-ups. Not only were they difficult, many of them were outright unfair. The average player didn't have the tools or timing down to counter absurd damage windows, and some bosses could wipe you out in 2 hits. Sure, there were still tests of skill, like any other arcade game, but they were designed to be unreasonably hard to get as many quarters out of the player and their companions as possible, and only the players with the most quarters could be the ones who made it to the end in a reasonably fast manner. They paid to get to the end. They paid to win. Where's the honor in that, right? But if you played better and more efficiently, you could make it a challenge to get to the end by spending the least amount of money possible. It's all about how you frame it as a way to justify the quarters spent. And if you still think it's too far-fetched to call arcade machines microtransactions, there were even some games that push the concept even further, and we see probably the first relevant use of the term microtransaction with Double Dragon 3, a game that had an actual in-game shop that allowed players to insert extra quarters to get extra items to make their playthrough as easy as possible. So the game gives you both the ability to purchase extra lives and better equipment with money. If those aren't microtransactions, I don't know what are. And I cannot discount the act of inserting a quarter into a machine. It activates a lot of receptors in the brain with the immediate feedback it gives to the player. Flashing lights, loud sounds, an affirmative bleep to know that the quarter was accepted. The machine wants your money, and it produces happy noises when you feed it. Which is why I find it funny when people say that games are only just now becoming predatory. Like my brother in Christ, they always were. You ever walk into an arcade? It's a sensory overload. That's why they made the attract screens so enticing. They want your money. So they showed off the best of what a game had to offer with bleeps and bloops and pretty colors. Every cabinet was an attempt to outshine the other that was right next to it. An arcade was a battle to see who could get your quarter, and only the successful ones would stay. Arcade machines are also very different beasts from games released today. Games developed in the 80s were considered very little outside of temporary entertainment, not even close to being considered an art form. They were products almost adjacent to mobile games, fun little things you play to pass the time every now and then. The monetization methods were even similar to what we see in mobile games as well. Die too early? Why not pump $1 in to get an extra life to make it even further? Want to play more? $1 for some energy goes a long way. It might seem like a stretch, but the more you consider just how much time has progressed and yet things seem oddly familiar, just everything costs more than what it used to, it's quite sobering. Even back then, the cogs in the heads of both developers and publishers were starting to turn. With tech constantly evolving and securing a persistent cash flow from these machines, they had the opportunity to experiment and introduce new experiences to these arcades no one had even thought possible for a cabinet. Publishers saw the large sums of money generated from these simple machines and started thinking some maybe not so great thoughts. These thoughts being, in what ways can we strangle the player for as much money as they have with each new game? While the arcades were popping and consumer electronics were also getting to a reasonable point where most American households had televisions, game studios saw an unprecedented opportunity. What if we sold arcade experiences that you could play at home? The idea was novel for sure. It had legs that just needed the right minds behind it to work. And so this is what I like to deem the silent era of microtransactions, as we see an unprecedented race for the home console market take place. Atari, Sega, and Nintendo were all at the forefront of this race, and with each company came a pristine catalog of arcade experiences at their disposal. They had plenty to adapt into games that people would jump on immediately. Now let's take a look at the logistics here. In order for someone to play a game at home, you had to purchase two things, one being the console and two being the game itself. Just using the NES as an example, buying an NES cost $149.99 at the time of release in 1985. According to inflation, it costs about $450 rounded up. Could you see an NES costing as much as a PS5? I couldn't, but that was the style at the time. Now, a game cartridge could vary in price, ranging from $29.99 to even $37.99. According to inflation, this would be upwards of $110? Whoa, mama, you gotta be kidding me. Selling a console game to a single household sure sounds a lot more profitable than letting people clamber around a single arcade machine, doesn't it? Can you see why arcades started to die off? I can. And so consoles really took over until they didn't and everything crashed in 1983. But there are plenty of videos that cover that, so I won't be talking about it too deeply. Needless to say, too many people were trying to cash in on the home console market, so it was flooded with shitty games that no one wanted to play, and everything was too expensive, so the whole market crashed. And when games cost as much as they did without any form of regulation, a lot of trash was pushed out without any oversight in terms of consistency and experience, which is why we see Nintendo games that have that official Nintendo seal of quality added to the box art these days. You knew when you bought a Nintendo game, your money was going towards a tightly crafted experience with minimal bugs and issues. The beginning of the home console era really was the silent era of microtransactions because it was exactly that. With the industry moving further away from arcades, more emphasis was put into the home console experience where all you had to do to play a game was buy it outright. A monumental concept, I know. Buying something and keeping it forever definitely won't be an issue in the future. Foreshadowing is a literary device where it was an era untainted by theoretically infinite financial scaling and instead focused on clear-cut, defined, well-crafted experiences. Purchases that you kept and would work as long as the console you had to play them on was kept in working condition, like any other electronics you might have in your house, like a fridge, stove, what have you. But gaming was still considered very much a luxury experience in the 80s and 90s when the cost of games were so unregulated. Not everyone had the money to own a TV, a console, and even more than one or two games because that could easily total over $1,000 by the time you had everything you needed. Arcades still served a purpose for those with less expendable income because they were much cheaper alternatives to get your quick gaming fix. A quarter still had value back then, believe it or not. Consoles started with 8-bit graphics and slowly progressed forward onto the polygonal stage with consoles like the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Dreamcast. I think the silent era will be one that a lot of people look back fondly to because not only were games monetized with the buy once, own forever format, we also saw a lot of experimentation from studios of all sizes. Big developers like Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony were butting heads in the console wars in an attempt to make the best damn video game they could, always pushing to make something new and innovative that would draw the most attention. And while that was going on, many smaller studios stepped up to create experiences of every shape and size to fill the AAA gap. They were smaller scale experiences, but they still offered the same quality that proven studios did. No longer was gaming the Wild West it was considered to be in the 80s. It was truly in a renaissance of constant progress. Even though I call the 80s to mid-2000s the silent era, that's not to say that microtransactions were exempt from this period. Even with the quarter-munching arcade machines being less prevalent as we near the 2000s, there was still an opportunity for people to spend their hard-earned money on something that hadn't really been seen before. The subscription MMO was born in a time where internet access was this burgeoning field, much like that of the console market. The birth of said subscription MMO is somewhat contested, and it isn't something very well documented, but the game that was the real trailblazer on the scene was Ultima Online. It was a boxed game that cost a pretty penny of $65, but it also required a subscription fee of $10 a month to play. Now, hold on. Would a subscription be a microtransaction? Well, if we go by the same logic we do with arcades, then yes, they very much are. Not only did the game require an upfront purchase, it also required you to pay every month in order to experience everything the game had to offer. Very much like how we do with modern live service games today, except the mandatory fee of the subscription subscription has turned into the optional battle pass. Subscription MMOs are still very much alive and well today, but this isn't about them. The subscription fees of MMOs past were very much a requirement, but the games didn't ask for much else outside of major content expansions. The subscription fee would cover server costs, patches that added new content over time, and events put on by game masters. This was an unprecedented time for gaming, something that had never been experienced before. But much like console gaming, it could only be experienced by those with a decent income stream, enough to cover internet, a PC, the base cost of the game, and the persistent subscription fee that came knocking each month. It was a great time to be a PC gamer because not only did players get the chance to experience online worlds with many other players, but they also had the opportunity to purchase expansions for games that already existed. These were very often used as a way to expand on already successful games and capitalize on working and existing source code to make content faster, cheaper, and with less headache. If you had a PC in the 2000s and remember the battle chest for older Blizzard titles like Warcraft 3 and StarCraft, or one of the various Sims 2 packs like Pets, you remember why these expansions were so fantastic. They were means of getting more of what was already good, and it allowed you to support studios directly as they continue to make new content. Technology was constantly moving forward, and game dev came along with it in due fashion. With new technology comes new gaming experiences to be had, and the 7th generation came knocking, with the Ethernet port being built into HD consoles shortly after. Gone was the era of split-screen and single-player platformers. Here comes the world of online gaming, and all the good and bad it had to offer. I'm sure many people thought that the 7th generation of consoles would be very similar to the few prior generations. Games would come out, you would play them, but this time you could play them online with your buddies, and that was it. But with the 7th generation of game consoles and the Ethernet port, we get introduced to what I would like to call ground zero for microtransactions as we know them today. I'm sure you know what I'm about to say. That's right, it's motherfucking horse armor! Let's hear it for horse armor, everybody. Oh man, what a classic. I love this, dude. I call horse armor ground zero for microtransactions because it really, honest to God, was. We may have had parts of it in the arcades, but this is when microtransactions really took full form. It was this little $2.50 add-on that you could buy that not only added something to your game, but it also had minor gameplay effects as well by boosting the health of your horse. Nothing like this had ever been done by a AAA developer before, and a lot of that has to do with how it was never really possible to do on a console like the PS2 and Xbox. It used to be when you bought a game, you got the whole game and didn't need to buy anything else. But this was the dawn of DLC as we know it. Downloadable content also sounds pretty nebulous as a term, doesn't it? It's not really as defined as it maybe could be, but it does what it says on the tin. It's downloadable content that you can add to a game. Seems simple enough, but the release of Horse Armor had more implications for the world of DLC and gaming microtransactions than could properly be accounted for. If you go back and look at forum discussions at the time, people were chastising the release of Horse Armor. They laughed at it. The armor was ridiculed, but people bought the damn thing, and they bought it a lot. According to our Lord and Savior, who could do nothing wrong, Todd Howard, he said in an interview with IGN, quote, "Horse Armor was one of the most popular DLC packs we've done, believe it or not. What's funny is we went away from Horse Armor and the rest of the industry has gone toward Horse Armor," end quote. Which is not entirely true because Bethesda loves introducing microtransaction mod stores into their games, so like, shut up, Todd. But whatever, you get the point. Horse Armor was big. It split the gaming community in half. One half said, "Hey, that's funny. It's only $2.50. I'll buy it." And the other half said, "Hey, that's stupid. It's $2.50. I just bought the damn game for $60. You know the butterfly effect? It's the idea that a single action has rippling effects on a timeline. Horse Armor was that ripple that started us on this path. And like Todd said, It only gets worse from here, but we'll get there eventually. For now, let's keep talking about the 7th generation of consoles and what other microtransactions were introduced during that period of time. With the 7th generation of consoles, we started seeing consoles come built in with Ethernet ports, as mentioned earlier. Connecting these little boxes of gaming hopes and dreams to the internet had never been easier, and it also paved the way to a lot of other interesting interactions for microtransactions, such as the map pack for Call of Duty, definitely one of the bigger ideas that popularized the idea of microtransactions to the masses. All it cost was a few bucks, and you could have new maps to play online with your buddies. Pretty cool concept, and you could even get new zombies maps. What a time to be alive. Mission packs for BioWare games, where you could get a brand new mini story for just a few dollars, was also a way to monetize single-player games moving forward. If you really liked a game and wanted to buy more of it, you had the autonomy to do so with the advent of these DLC packs. It lets the consumer cater their own experiences by either spending more on something they already had or buy the hot new thing. This had been done on the PC circuit before with multiplayer first-person shooters, but this was also the first time something like this had been widely popularized for modern audiences, because all you had to do was swipe a card, download the files over your dial-up, and the box under your TV just did the rest of the work for you. No having to mail order a disc or go to a big box retailer that might have the game. Everything was available online. It felt like the possibilities for what you could get on a console store were limitless, and we also got to what is probably one of the most crazy things to ever be introduced to gaming to this day. When Valve dropped this little game called Team Fortress 2, they decided to perform a little experiment. Since they owned Steam, they thought it would be neat if players were able to buy and sell items over their marketplace. So they introduced what is commonly known today as the loot box, an item that contained a set amount of items of varying rarity with unique effects that would fetch the price of whatever the players deemed they were worth, with the boxes and keys serving as the baseline price for the market going forward. Not only did these items allow for player self-expression, they also made a new passive income stream for Valve because they got a 15% cut on all transactions made on the Steam marketplace. Others might even call this ground zero when it comes to microtransactions, as it was Valve's way of introducing the predatory practice of loot boxes into the gaming landscape. Because not only was it profitable, it was popular. It allowed players to buy and sell things they earned by playing, and if they had expendable income, they could invest more into the game and even buy Steam games by selling what they earned. This had never been seen in the gaming landscape before. The only right word to use for these loot boxes is revolutionary. This little experiment would have knock-on effects in the industry, but we really wouldn't see anything like it at a larger scale until the mid-2010s, but also implemented in a much worse fashion. Until then, companies making console games were still trying to push the limits of what players would pay for in terms of microtransactions for their games. Map packs were a huge hit, but they ended up splintering the player bases of the games because those that didn't buy the packs were unable to play on them in most instances. With the rise of online consoles and marketplaces also came the rise of the mini expansion. Think of them like a mix between the expansions of the late 90s to early 2000s PC games and the mission packs for games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age. These were developers testing the waters even more with bigger content patches that could deliver whole, self-contained side narratives that weren't too big or too small. They gave the player the ability to expand their game world by a decent amount and give enough content to feel like it was matching the asking price. So stuff like expansions for Fallout 3 like The Pit, Mothership Zeta, and Operation Anchorage, to list a few examples. These sorts of micro expansions let the developers expand on what knowledge they had cultivated while developing the main game and make content even faster for a profit. It was a good idea, and is honestly one of my personal favorite ways to monetize a game, because some of these expansions added new systems on top of the main experience. Take Skyrim for instance. Skyrim had the Dawnguard expansion, which let the player take up the role of becoming a vampire and playing the game a whole new way, and there was the Hearthfire, which let the player purchase land in the game world and expand their home Animal Crossing style as they play. Expansions like this felt like a good middle ground between the microtransaction cosmetics of horse armor and the large expansions of PC gaming's past, but brought to a more modern standard. Things seemed alright for gaming. These DLC practices seemed like everything was going just fine, but ground zero can't stay contained for long, and the infection starts to spread. Symptoms are starting to show, and this is the point in time where the term microtransaction gets muddy and a lot more complicated. During this era, we also saw the introduction of the Season Pass. LA Noire was a game that championed the concept forward, as it was a game based heavily on the episodic crime-solving format, so it worked perfectly with the monetization method. The idea was that you bought this pass that gave you a few new missions that you could play through as part of the base game. These were priced fairly reasonably in relation to the base game, and you could even get them cheaper if pre-ordered ahead of the official launch. $4 for a downloadable case doesn't seem too bad, does it? Well, that's where we get into the muddy territory. Oftentimes with content like this, the quality of the content is quite suspect. When a player is encouraged to buy into a DLC practice that isn't proven, like micro missions like this, players could be spending money on something that's completely terrible or doesn't stack up to the main game in any way. Speaking of pre-orders, this was another dastardly trend around the end of the 7th generation of consoles. This was a point in time where seemingly every retailer had a unique cosmetic attached to a game's pre-order as a way to secure purchases from people too caught up in the hype cycle to sit back and think critically about getting a game that could be dog shit. You were forced to pre-order to get a complete game, and if you didn't, you would have to buy the included DLC after the game was fully released. Case in point, Metro Last Light. Before putting the game to market, THQ decided to capitalize on the trend of pre-order bonuses by making a whole exclusive version of the game that had the hardcore difficulty locked behind on-disc DLC, and the only way it could be accessed was to either pre-order the game or to buy the microtransaction that unlocked it. It was a whole new level of greed that hadn't really been seen up to that point, locking out essential features like difficulty behind a paywall. On-disc DLC was a massive controversy in the early 2010s because it was companies locking out what could have essentially been part of the main game, but instead were locked behind short-sighted purchases. People were okay with the concept of DLC content, but the idea that there was content on the disc that you paid for, but you didn't have access to, was a whole new level of greed. In today's gaming landscape, publishers encourage the pre-ordering of games by providing customers with the promise of nifty, poorly made collectibles that they can add to their collections to gather dust, so at least that's one trend that died out for the most part. This was also the golden era of episodic games like The Walking Dead, Tales from the Borderlands, and The Wolf Among Us by Telltale, where the player could either buy the game and all of its episodes outright, or buy them all piecemeal as they came out. These were budget games first and foremost, so their gameplay wasn't anything to write home about. You bought in for the story, and the writing was always good enough for the player to tune in when a new episode hit. It was a way for games to be more manageable for players who might have more to do in their everyday life. You could sit down for a few hours, bust out this tightly crafted narrative adventure, then tune back in a few weeks later for the new episode to drop. And let's not forget our golden god, Valve, introducing one more solid microtransaction banger to the world. If you know the Battle Pass, we have to respect the OG, and Valve can be credited for inventing the concept. The very first gaming Battle Pass was introduced to Dota 2 in 2013 as a way to both crowdfund the yearly international tournament Valve hosts and allows players to buy in, rank up, earn rewards, and vote for their favorite teams to earn more and more experience to rank up their pass. Every purchase made to the Battle Pass would have a portion added to the international tournament's prize pool, so Valve and the players could crowdfund the event every year to an ever-increasing pool of money for the best players in the world to compete for. And the more the community contributed, the more they were rewarded as a community with new cosmetics, couriers, and so on. It's a brilliant concept, really, but it came with some downsides. As years went by, Valve realized just how much some people would be willing to level up their battle pass, as you were able to buy levels, just as any good battle pass lets you do, of course. Some people would even pump their battle pass level into the hundreds, so Valve had to find ways to reward these players who spent all this money by making rewards go higher and higher. The battle passes for Dota 2 were notoriously difficult to get through, so Valve all but encouraged players to spend money to get the cosmetic rewards in the highest tiers by using FOMO as a tactic. If you couldn't get all the rewards the Battle Pass had to offer in the half year it was open, you were shit out of luck. I still think it's a good concept to use a Battle Pass for funding a major event, as it also makes the community more invested in the game as a hobby in both good and bad ways, but everything sours with time and Battle Passes are no different. But we'll get there in due time. Some of these microtransactions introduced in the 7th generation would stay for some time, but others would eventually actually combine to give the player less and less in terms of gameplay and autonomy over their gameplay experience. We would start to see less of these micro DLCs as games moved away from giving players the ability to cater their content experience with new potential content to buy, and they would instead start poisoning the well more and more with every passing year, with microtransactions to both cost more and offer less in terms of actual gameplay value. The fact that you can support a studio with the purchase of some additional content is great in theory, but in practice, well, what do they say about the road to hell being paved with good intentions? And speaking of hell, when Diablo 3 first released, it was one of the first AAA games to release with a fully functional auction house in a game, powered by both in-game gold and real-world money via payment processing services like PayPal. Now, if you know MMOs, you know about the auction house. It's generally a place where players from all over the server can submit items that other players can buy at a set price or auction off to a higher bidder. And with auction houses comes the desire for players to sell gold outside of the game in order to trivialize any in-game pursuits or challenges. The introduction of the auction houses in Diablo 3 was Blizzard's attempt to legitimize third-party item resellers that ran rampant in looters like Diablo 2, so that they could cut down on fraud and scams that those third parties could pose. It was also their chance to get a cut of the sweet financial pie that was clearly theirs to begin with, because of course with every real money auction house transaction that took place, Blizzard would take a cut. Blizzard ran it in a fashion very similar to how Valve runs their in-game economies with CSGO and Dota 2, but turns out adding a way for players to flip items for in-game gold and real-world cash money wasn't such a great idea. It allowed the players to flood the markets with items they didn't need because the game dropped items biased against the class they played, which encouraged them to put up items they didn't need and buy the ones for the class they actually did play. So they would go in, buy what they needed from the auction house when they hit a difficulty roadblock, and then trudge on without any issue. It made the game too easy because you could just buy your power instead of working for it, making Diablo 3 a game that encouraged pay to win in all but necessity. It's one of the first and only instances where a AAA game allowed players to directly purchase in-game items with an actual price tag associated with them, like an actual ass $sign right next to it. After this point, games would take a lot more care into obfuscating buying power via unique in-game currencies as a way to make players spend more unknowingly, because when you see an actual $sign next to something, it makes the player able to make comparisons to things they could buy at the store with similar pricing. The goal of making microtransactions trickier to understand is to make the value of the dollar less obvious when converted into a digital currency. Remember when Xbox Live used to have point cards? That's why they did it. So it made it seem less like a dollar spent and more like a digital currency with more inherent value within its own ecosystem. And now I think it's time to talk about mobile games, which deserve a small section all of their own. The people that play them very rarely interact with gaming outside of their phones, so developers are encouraged to find new and creative ways to make people spend time in very different ways. Mobile games are designed to be fast-paced, easily accessible experiences that don't eat up a lot of time, which is why games like Candy Crush are so popular. Candy Crush was released in 2012 and is the most downloaded Match 3 game to ever exist. It has 14,000 levels with the most dedicated 0.5% of players reaching them, and that 0.5% is 2 million people. Go figure. Mobile games use their simplicity to their advantage. They keep gameplay tidy and neat so everything gets wrapped up in just a few minutes. Do a few matches here, play a level or two here, and you can call it a day. But where it gets really suspect is when a player wants to do even more than that. When Facebook games were a thing, they had this devious little system called Energy, which allowed a player to only perform so many actions in a day to make sure they would always come back the next day to keep playing. Mobile games like Candy Crush adopted this system and made the game experience more level-based. So when you load into a level, you automatically spend a certain amount of energy to play, and if you don't have enough, you would have to wait for the energy to recharge to resume. But people want instant gratification, so they will happily spend $1 or $2 to get themselves the premium currency they need to refill their energy meter, and that nickel and diming adds up fast. And people have done this enough times to make Candy Crush generate $20 billion in revenue since it was released. Are you starting to understand why games are starting to adopt these microtransaction methods from mobile games? I don't think any console game in existence has ever generated $20 billion in 12 years of existing. Not even Grand Theft Auto has made those numbers. It's important to know that the majority of money in mobile markets and games with microtransactions only come from the most dedicated players, also known as whales. You've probably heard of the term. It's the idea that the spenders in games come in different sizes of sea mammals. The bigger the spender, the bigger the creature, and whales are the biggest. While there are so few of them, they eat the most to fulfill their needs. Or in this analogy, they spend the most to fulfill their needs. This is where the majority of microtransaction purchases come from and where the majority of mobile games make their money. It's a relatively new concept, but ever since it was introduced, it still holds true. The biggest spenders will stay playing no matter what. The game is part of the routine for them now, and very little will change that. Time moves fast in the gaming industry. It's no longer the 7th generation of consoles. Horse armor and DLC mission packs are old news. Gaming has reached the 8th generation, and we're sitting pretty in the 9th generation right now. The cost to develop a AAA game has risen exponentially over the past 10 years in order to meet consumer demand for more graphically intensive games and to make games bigger with each passing entry. Because when you buy a new game in an existing franchise, you never expect it to look and play like the last game. You want more. Better graphics, more gameplay, more stuff to do. It's reaching this point of no return, and we're starting to plateau. So developers need more money. It's not a great idea to push hundreds of millions of dollars into a single game, because once you reach a milestone like that, you're almost guaranteed to never make your money back. There are only so many people that will buy your game. There are only so many consoles in the market, and word of mouth only goes so far. Selling 200 million units of a game just isn't a feasible or realistic goal for game developers, unless you're Grand Theft Auto, but it's very much an outlier. Budgets are inflating. It requires upwards of 100 developers to make a AAA game with a massive amount of polish, and developers cost a lot of money to keep on payroll. Selling a game one time only gets you that one sale, and one sale doesn't have the power it used to back in the early 2000s when development costs were much lower. So publishers got to thinking, how can we make people who bought our game keep spending money inside of it? What if we did horse armor, but worse, and make a lot more of it? And maybe we can even learn what mobile games did and adapt that into more AAA experiences. It started off on a pretty small scale. While the loot boxes of Valve-developed properties flourished on the PC market, the console market started seeing the introduction of loot boxes of their own design. These loot boxes, however, were not even remotely similar to those in CSGO or TF2. While you could trade the items you received on those marketplaces with other players, and they allowed for a sort of self-expression by the player as they were purely cosmetic, the console market took a very different approach to the design. Instead of focusing on cosmetics, it focused on being able to buy power via the loot box. The first example we saw of this was the game UEFA Champions League 2006-07. This football game was the first one to adapt the ever-popular Ultimate Team mode we've seen in FIFA, Madden, and 2K basketball games. If you've never played a sports game, the concept is pretty simple. By playing the game, you are able to pull these collectible card packs that you can rip open to find players of varying skill levels from every team possible. The cards have different rarities that can allow them to perform slightly better than cards of lower ranks, and you keep collecting and opening these packs, swapping in better cards, and eventually create your ultimate team and duke it out against other players who do the same. Or you could, shell out a few dollars to get a few packs immediately instead of spending all of your free time grinding for them. This has been EA's go-to method for monetizing their sports games with every new entry with little to no changes, and it works every damn year. I don't understand sports, so I don't understand the appeal of these sports games, but it's apparent there's something here that keeps dragging people back in to play them. Perhaps it's the loot boxes in general and their addictive nature, because it sure as shit isn't the gameplay. These games don't change year over year and are often chastised because they're just minor facelifts of last year's version. If you have any idea why people come back to play these games every year, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your take on the topic, because frankly, I just don't understand why people keep playing these things. But needless to say, EA learned all of the wrong lessons from how Valve implemented the system years ago. Players don't get to carry over any of the in-game purchases they made from years prior. All of the money they spent is just gone in the wind. The reason Valve did it in the first place was because their market for items could exist in perpetuity. TF2, Dota 2, and CSGO will always have financial value attached to every single item. So even if you do gamble your money away on loot boxes, there is still an opportunity to sell the items you unbox. But here, with FIFA and Madden and all of the other sports games, the purchases the player makes to produce the best possible fantasy teams get trashed, and players eat it up year after year after year with seemingly no end in sight. Predatory is too weak a word to describe how this plays out. It's straight up evil, and EA keeps getting away with it. But they're also the company behind the sense of pride and accomplishment saying that probably holds the record for most downvoted comment in Reddit history. And they even lobbied to Congress to make sure loot boxes stay unregulated regulated so they can continue to fuck over as many people as possible while they still can. So like, there's that. Loot boxes didn't just appear in sports games. They were introduced into other multiplayer games like Battlefront 2, another EA published joint. Players could play with the potential to earn these loot boxes as they had skills and vehicles and characters locked behind them, or if you played enough to get in-game currency, you were able to obtain them one by one. Another famous example is Overwatch. Overwatch was a brilliant idea because it was this one-time purchase and all future characters and maps were free to everyone. The only thing that cost money were the loot boxes that contained cosmetic items like skins, voice lines, sprays, and a few other things. And even Call of Duty Vanguard got in on the craze by replicating what Overwatch did, where players could perform daily and weekly challenges to get new cosmetics for their account. Now, here's the rough part. These were fully priced $60 games launching with functional gambling mechanics. You could unlock these things just by playing, but the rate at which you could earn the in-game currencies to unlock said items could take years if you wanted everything, meaning it was never meant to be a viable option to unlock everything in the first place. The loot boxes were this invasive species supplanting old school unlockables because publishers found out that people would pay money to unlock these things. And a lot of people did. Man, we're not off to a good start, are we? Gacha games also took off around this time in the flourishing mobile market. Gacha, for those unaware, is a shortening of the term gachapon that originates from Japan, which are these little capsule machines that give out a random item displayed on the front of the unit. Usually they're these little cute items like keychains or mini collectibles, but it really took off in the mobile market as companies adopted that type of gambling mentality and put it on your phone, all while making it much more expensive. Think of gacha like loot boxes for weebs, but gacha only gives you one thing for each time you spend money. At least loot boxes give you a few things in most instances. These gacha games allow the player to convert real-world money into in-game currency, which they can use to buy tickets to spend on banners. These banners are often limited time instances, so if you're looking for a specific one, then you save and gamble all of your tickets at once. If you've played a mobile gacha, you've played basically all of them because the systems are identical between all of them. And when I say identical, I mean they're all incredibly predatory. Not only are these gacha mechanics tied deep into the roots of loot boxes with the mystery outcome scenario, the chances of even getting the rarest pieces of loot are astronomically low. The chances are so low, in fact, that China has realized this was an issue and made it so if a game is released in their country with those mechanics, companies are forced to post the chances of obtaining said items. These chances can be as low as 0.6% to pull the strongest characters in the game, but the chances get immeasurably higher with each pull a customer makes. It's a problem that's so bad that companies have to implement pity pulls to ensure that a customer is guaranteed a certain rank or character if they invest enough time and money into the game, because if they don't win at some point, they'll never come back. That's just the psychology of gambling. You never know when that big win is coming, so you pull and pull with the chance that the next one is definitely going to be the one. You know what they say, 99.99% of gamblers quit right before they win big, which isn't true, by the way. This is just a joke just to make that crystal clear. So microtransactions are getting more and more out of control. We've slowly moved away from things that add value to the baseline gameplay experience in the form of the expansion and even mini DLCs that add new missions and maps to games, and are instead focusing on squeezing players for everything they're worth with loot box mechanics and cosmetics that add no gameplay value. Microtransactions are putting the industry in critical condition. The horse armor we once knew is gone, and console games are taking more and more influence from the constantly evolving mobile market and how they attempt to monetize the games to nickel and dime their way to profits. It sure has been a while since we've heard from the Battle Pass, huh? Maybe they are performing better than loot boxes have. I mean, they seem to be a great way to reward those who play the game for long periods of time by giving them free cosmetics and premium currency and keep funding the game they love playing. Let's take a look to see how those are going in recent times. So Apex Legends recently came out with a change to their Battle Pass system that made it so their Battle Pass for each season would be split into two parts. Not only that, the premium currency in the pass itself was now not able to be used to redeem next season's pass, forcing the players to spend hard cash to buy it. And to top it all off, the split pass would cost the same as it did before. Now you would have to pay 2 times games to get the full thing. So let's break that down. Not only would you have to pay twice as much to get what was originally a whole season's worth of content, but you can't even purchase the pass with the premium currency you earned last season. The reason behind this decision was puzzling. According to the official Apex website, the changes made to the Battle Pass system was to, quote, improve the value, reduce the time needed to unlock higher end items, and more, end quote. To say people were angry would be a massive understatement. It was a massive kick in the teeth for the hardcore Apex community because it not only devalued the Apex coins that they had obtained prior through previous battle passes and by spending their money, but it also made it so players were forced to spend money outside of the game's ecosystem each time they wanted to get everything a pass had to offer. Sure, they might have gotten more rewards like cooler skins and weapons and such, but they had their autonomy taken away as players, and players responded in kind the only way they knew how to. Review bombing the game on Steam. Whales with thousands of hours and dollars spent on the game trashed the changes made, and for good reason, I think. This was EA and Respawn not only charging more, but taking options away from their dedicated player base in order to farm more money from them. We knew these companies were greedy, but this was just saying the quiet part out loud. And as I was writing this script, Respawn reverted a lot of the changes they made with the split pass system and made it so players are still able to purchase future passes with premium currency earned through the battle passes. And they're even making the very first split passes premium track free to earn by doing in-game challenges as a sign of goodwill towards the players. But for many, the damage was done. This was their sign to leave the game for good. All it took was the Predator showing its bloody teeth how bad microtransactions could really be in free-to-play games. I hope all of the Apex players leaving the game find something a bit more stable that they can enjoy in their spare time. I hope they can find a game that respects both them as a player and their free time. But games like that are getting more difficult to find in today's gaming landscape. Not only are free games getting the exploitative battle pass treatment, but so are fully priced $70 AAA games. And not just battle passes either. Games are launching with microtransaction stores to boost the gameplay experience of single-player games as well. One of the most egregious examples of this in recent memory is Middle-earth's Shadows of War. The game sees your character obtain randomized orcs from around the world to defend your settlements, become commanders of your armies, be your bodyguard, and so on. These orcs come in different tiers with better perks as they go up in tier. So epics are better than normals, legendaries are better than epics, you get the gist. And these orcs have the opportunity to die permanently, so you have to be careful on how you use them. Put them in a precarious situation and they might die fairly quickly as a result. You have to level the orcs and consistently replace them with better ones to stay on top of the harder requirements the game throws your way as you progress through the narrative. The game gets very grindy and repetitive after a long while of fighting, converting, and leveling orcs in attempts to make your armies stronger. So the developers had the brilliant idea to spice up the game a bit by introducing a fully fledged in-game shop that allows the player to spend one of 3 types of currencies to open one of 4 types of loot boxes. In order to get these currencies to open the boxes, the player could play the game normally and acquire them slowly, or perform daily tasks in order to spend them on loot boxes to get better gear, orcs, or limited time boosts to your character. The game tried everything in its power to make the currencies and loot box systems as difficult to understand as possible, and for a primarily single-player game, this didn't sit well with anybody, really. Not only did it affect how the game was designed on a fundamental level to artificially inflate game time, it also had the knock-on effect of normalizing how to implement buying power in a single-player open-world game. Thus, it became a trend during that time, even outside of modern sports titles, and a decent handful of open-world games would adapt this to fit their own progression systems. A few years after launch, the in-game shop was summarily shit-canned and removed from the game entirely, most likely because it was deemed no longer profitable enough to keep running. But the damage was done. Warner Brothers made their cash money and said peace out. It proved that nothing is truly safe from the implementation of exploitative microtransactions that are constantly working against the players. There are, however, some games that do microtransactions, in particular battle passes, correctly, and I can think of no better example than Deep Rock Galactic. Deep Rock does this wonderful thing where every new season, a player can log in, play through the season normally to earn rewards, and all of the new content that was added that season is added to the game in general. No FOMO, just fun. Another game that I think does battle passes correctly is Fortnite. Fortnite really does just about everything well when it comes to the battle pass, because not only does it reward players no matter how they play the game, it's able to consistently and reasonably reward the player just by playing with premium currency, even by playing the free tier. It doesn't take months to grind the pass to completion, as it's obviously a more casual experience meant for all age groups. So it's something a lot of games could learn from. More games need to give the player the opportunity to reward their player with premium currency just by playing casually. I'm still not a fan of how the rest of the cosmetics are priced in the game outside of the pass, because those bundles can get real pricey real fast. The industry is, without a doubt, not in a very good place right now. Not only are games more expensive than they've ever been, but they're also releasing probably as unfinished as they've ever been as well. And recently we've seen a barrage of these half-baked sequels that have been releasing with less content than was released with the game prior and don't even work. Cities Skylines 2, Payday 3, and Modern Warfare 3 are a few examples that come straight to mind. Games that say they're sequels, but do little to overhaul the experiences the previous games offer. The only reason they exist is to extract money from the existing audiences, but doing the bare minimum to really do anything unique with the sequel format. Companies are releasing games with fully functional cash shops and DLCs right out of the gate, but when it comes to actually playing the game, things are half-baked, poorly thought out, and just unfun. City Skylines 2 released with terrible optimization and didn't work well on even the most powerful rigs, and now Paradox is in panic mode to fix the game. A very similar situation happened with Payday 3. Payday 2 is a game that's well over 10 years old and is showing its age, but it has a massive amount of content under its belt, and many people still play it religiously to this day because it works, unlike Payday 3. When it launched, it just didn't work. Servers were not functional for over 2 weeks, and the devs did little to assure the player base that this was just a hiccup. Instead, it was a massive fuck up and one of the worst game launches I have ever seen. Who knew that launching a purely server-based game without a single-player mode could be a bad decision? Many people took this as a call to just stop playing Payday 3 altogether, and the player count tells the whole story really. A $40 game that doesn't work versus a game with loads of free content that you can buy for the price of a pack of gum on a good day, and it works? I think the answer is very clear. And then there's Modern Warfare 3, which is just, I think many other people would give you a deeper dive on what makes this game such a mess. Not only are the multiplayer maps from the original Modern Warfare 2, but the single player campaign just reuses the majority of the Warzone map. Not a great look, but if you love COD, I guess it's just more of the same. Enough people buy it every year that it's not really an issue. There's clearly plenty of content, but that doesn't mean all of it is stellar. It has battle passes, premium cosmetic packs, an absurd amount of reused content from previous years, and is always pushing out more and more slop to consume. These are some of the reasons why the games are so successful as they are. COD has an addictive gameplay loop that keeps you engaged in the ecosystem for longer, always encouraging you to spend more and more money for cool new skins that no one else has. This is where Call of Duty makes the majority of its money, just like all of the mobile games it takes influence from. So the release of a new game every year is just a formality at this point. It all leads back to the idea that people are spending more than ever on games that offer less in terms of content. In the 5th and 6th generation of gaming, you could just go to the store, buy a game, and play it. That was it. It's becoming harder and harder to do that in today's gaming landscape, because when you buy a game, you're not just buying the game. You're buying into a live service or a cash shop with unique currencies and cosmetic DLCs and season passes and so on and on. Even in fully priced AAA games, mind you. It's so tiring when every game wants not just the asking price, but more on top of it. I think that is playing a major factor in the massive downswing in player sentiment over the past few years. Trust between players and game studios is what I would like to think is at an all-time low. Because if games can't make their money back in development costs by selling a copy, then players are expected to be nickel and dimed by every single game they play. $70 isn't enough anymore. Now you're expected to spend a whole paycheck's worth of money in order to get the full experience a game has to offer. And sometimes that isn't just cosmetics. It also applies to gameplay. In recent Ubisoft games, we saw the introduction of XP boosters that allow you to purchase them to speed up the rate of XP you gain in order to get through the single-player RPG faster. This massive, sprawling 60-hour RPG has things built into the game to make getting through it less of a chore. Tell me how that's supposed to be fun. How the hell have games regressed to the point where buying a game isn't to have fun, but to be a job? Sometimes people are willing to pay to make things less of a hassle, and that's what a microtransaction like that is. Now look, I don't want to be the guy that shames someone for buying something like this. I understand that there is a desire for spending on microtransactions. I'm an adult with money. I'm not afraid to say that yes, even I have bought one Fortnite pass and Overwatch loot boxes when they still existed. Boo me all you want, no one is infallible. But now I'm older and I have money I need to spend elsewhere. I've got rent. I've got to pay for groceries. I've got a phone bill. This shit isn't cheap, man. Gaming as a hobby for me is not cheap. I try to play everything and that's just not feasible. I've come to terms that in most instances when I spend money on a game's microtransactions, I just don't own them. So I don't do it anymore. Money that went towards a $15 Fortnite skin could have got me a few days worth of food instead. There are, however, people with a lot more expendable income than me, and that's how we get people that spend $500 on a League of Legends skin. Side note, did you know that when Riot paid Faker, the top League of Legends competitive player, to advertise the skin they made specifically for him and the character he mains, to live stream for 1 hour, he managed to sell over $662,000 worth of skin bundles? Oh man, League Gooners really are a breed apart, man. Now, you want to know how much people will spend on a single microtransaction? You know, in quotes. Well, the king is undoubtedly Star Citizen, the game that will for sure come out soon after just 12 years of development and $700 million spent. Guys, we promise it's coming out. Anyway, the developers behind Star Citizen really do everything in their power to make players feel invested in the game's seemingly endless development by making them pay upwards of $48,000 to own every ship in the game, as all of that money spent goes straight to the developers of the game. Star Citizen has no publisher, and the game isn't available on any widely used game launcher like Steam. I think the concept of the microtransactions is sound, but the prices aren't matching up. There's no way that buying every ship in the game is really worth $48,000. You'd be better off investing into the company directly than fluffing their coffers with purchases like this. And kind of reaching back to how many people spent money on sports games, it was also recently reported that the release of EA College Football 25 had over 2.2 million people pay an extra $30 just to play the game early, meaning those who chose to fork out the extra cash get a head start in crafting their ultimate teams. 2.2 million people chose to spend money to spend more money. I'm just dumbfounded. Like, I get it. Clearly people like college ball, and I'm not one of those people. But this is just absurd. This is just another form of fanaticism that I clearly have not bore witness to. All of this to say that there is no upper limit when it comes to spending on microtransactions in games. Just like how there is no limit to spending on things in real life. People will clearly buy what they want. But I think that's missing the bigger picture. When someone buys a microtransaction in these games, there really isn't any value associated with them anymore. The items on sale are valued at what the company values them as. So a $500 League skin bundle is what Riot seems to think it's worth, and also what players will spend to have it. So when someone buys it, they agree to that price assessment. And clearly it's paying dividends for Riot. And with more and more people buying bundles like that, prices are only going to go up from there. It really makes me curious to see how much someone would be willing to pay for one microtransaction in a game. The term microtransaction is losing value with each year we see companies make moves like this. It's not a microtransaction anymore. These are mortgage payments. These are new cars. But some people would rather buy an item that offers nothing in terms of gameplay value other than some fancy animations. Only time will tell to see where we end up in 10 years, I guess. Things are only getting worse each passing year when it comes to microtransactions, but it's hard to see it happen when you're in the thick of it, because change isn't immediate. It's something that happens slowly over time. Have you ever heard of boiling frog syndrome? It also goes by creeping normality. If you're unfamiliar, let me explain. Boiling frog syndrome is a metaphor saying that if you put a frog into boiling water, it will jump straight out because the difference it creates in its body temperature is too drastic. toxic, like how Respawn changed the battle pass too harshly so people bounced. But if you put a frog into room temperature water and let it heat up to a boil slowly, the frog won't realize that it's being cooked to death until it's too late. It's a metaphor that has been told for many, many years as a cautionary tale where people in the middle of slow change don't realize it until things have gone too far. And that's what we're seeing with microtransactions in games with the implementation of price anchoring as a major marketing tactic. Now, what is price anchoring? Price anchoring is when marketing teams put two purchase options next to each other, where one deal seems better than the other because it's a better offer by comparison. And this is a great way to increase sales. It's a concept that ties into recency bias when making decisions because we as humans are more inclined to spend money on what we perceive as being a deal. You know, coupons? Year-long subscription offers? That's a price anchor. It lets the buyer have the illusion of having power over the transaction by making a more financially responsible purchase while also making the seller look like the good guy in the transaction because they're taking a hit to their bottom line to sell you more. It requires the seller to also make a tiered entry system to a product or service with different pricing for each tier. Prices can start at $5 and work their way up to give you marginally better deals with the more you spend. Let's use Diablo 4 as an example. Diablo 4, like most AAA games releasing nowadays, is a full-priced $70 game that is released with a fully functional premium cash shop that lets the player buy premium currency in order to get some pretty swanky cosmetics for their characters. And the player has multiple entry points to get the currency, starting at $5 for 500 platinum, going all the way up to $150 for 18,500 platinum. A few months ago, Blizzard introduced a bundle to the game that costs $64.99 that gives the buyer a fancy-looking mount and 7,000 of the game's premium currency. If you were to buy the game on its own at standard price, it would cost $50. So we're already seeing a microtransaction in a game cost more than the game itself. Not a great start. It's pretty common for mount skins in Diablo 4 to run about $18 each, but this is a mount that is tied to a bundle. It is not available outside of it. It cannot be bought on its own. And if we calculate that if the 7 purchases of 1,000 platinum would cost $70, the $64.99 deal with the horse seems like a much better offer, doesn't it? I mean, it's basically a free horse and you get 500 bonus platinum. Already a huge step up over the $70 purchase you would have made otherwise, right? That is price anchoring in effect. Both price anchoring and boiling frog syndrome are being used in tandem to push microtransactions into this gray area that seems to get darker and darker with each passing year. Another great thing about modern microtransactions is this really neat trick that they do where many items in premium shops are somehow either slightly above or below just what you need premium currency wise in order to purchase them. Like, great, I just bought $20 worth of premium currency. I can get that awesome cosmetic set of armor for $13? Well, that's a strange price, but I'll get it. But now I only have $7 worth of premium currency left. Nothing in the store is exactly $7. It's either above or below that. And that's where they get you. When you buy into their systems, they make it so one transaction can be enough to make the next purchase slightly more or less what you think it should be, always putting your in-game wallet in a precocious situation. You never have enough for what you want. And if you do and you spend it, it's going to make the next purchase much more difficult. And now let's get into what all these dirty, disgusting tricks all trickle down to. If you know anything about the state of gaming recently, you've probably noticed the trend of how many games coming out these days are live services. Live services are a topic for a whole different video altogether, which I have made and you should check out, but the foundation of live service games is the idea that you are introduced to them via a free-to-play model and are encouraged to play seasonally in order to grind battle passes to get cosmetics, weapons, items, currency, you name it. But the thing about live services is that they are services first, and services never last forever. When a server dies, so does the game it hosts. Whether it's Fortnite or World of Warcraft or Apex Legends, these games will cease to exist, and eventually, so will your purchases. So not only are we as consumers paying for these microtransactions, we are purchasing something with lifespans that we have no input on. Live services live and die by their monetization and initial sales. If a game fails to establish a solid enough player base for the initial year, it's very difficult difficult to keep them invested in the initial experience. So the game dies out faster as a result, meaning those microtransactions you bought disappear faster. Nier Reincarnation, for example, was a game that released in February 2021 that allowed the player to spend real-world cash money on getting in-game currency to get characters, weapons, and items to help you progress further into the game's narrative, or at least you were able to. Because as of April of 2024, a little over 3 years of the game being out and people being able to put money into their anime girl themed slot machine, the game was shut down. And now all the people that put money into the game can't play it anymore. That's right, the game all of those people spent God knows how much money on can't even touch it anymore. And that is the fate for all live service games. And it makes me incredibly sad for all of these people that ended up spending money on these games, because that's money they will never get back. Square Enix really said, you will own nothing and like it. And people have no recourse because they signed the EULA. Can't play the game without signing the EULA, and the EULA says that you don't own the game. Even if you spend $70, even if you spent 100 plus on skins, and these publishers will do their damnedest to make sure you never get a lick of it back once the servers go down. If a game isn't generating enough revenue for a company to run, it's easier to pull the plug than to try their best to attempt to save it by letting players host their own servers. Because if players host their own servers, that means the original developers can't sell them battle passes or cosmetics. The gaming sphere has been seeing this gradual evolution of microtransactions from a single quarter at a time into thinly veiled gambling mechanics that obfuscate results and overpriced cosmetic purchases in order to make you spend more and more. When arcades were more prevalent, at least a quarter would let you play. A quarter meant something because it was what let you interface with the end product. You couldn't play if you didn't have a quarter, simple as that. And a quarter was definitely worth a lot more in the 80s than it was today. A quarter in the 80s would calculate to about $1 today, according to the government's Consumer Price Index. Could you imagine straight up just putting $1 into a Dig Dug cabinet and only lasting 3 minutes because you suck at the game? I couldn't, but that is the social contract you sign. You don't own the arcade machine. It is a product designed to eat your money for entertainment, and gaming today is no different in that respect. Hell, we're probably closer to arcade machines than we ever have been, spending money to own nothing, all under the promise of short-term satisfaction. When you buy something in one of these games that I mentioned, you are buying nothing. Just like FIFA, just like Nier Reincarnation, just like Overwatch, and all of those other live service games out there. You don't own it. So therefore, what you buy has no value. Like, you can use it, but when those servers go down, you can say goodbye to all of that money, just like those arcade machines. So ask yourself this question. Are you content with the idea that the microtransactions you buy in a live service game don't actually belong to you? I know I don't. So here we are. Current day. I hear the phrase vote with your wallet very often in the gaming ecosystem when it comes to microtransactions, a phrase voiced by disgruntled people who have had it with how predatory the microtransactions have started and what they are becoming. And it's a good set of words, honestly, because it gives power to the people to let their wallet speak for them. It's not a phrase exclusive to gaming, of course. It's a classic one that has connections to the free market. It whittles down to what sells works. And as it turns out, microtransactions really do work, and they have been for a long time. A recent study was performed by Ipsos in October of 2023 that involved 841 Americans between the age of 13 and 34 in order to gauge how frequently this age group actively spent money on microtransactions over a 6-month period. Author of the article, Christopher Hoffman, wrote, quote, "In the past 6 months, 85% of P13 through 34 core gamers have spent money in the game sector by purchasing a game, expansion / season / battle pass, microtransactions, or gaming subscription service. Among these gamers, spending tends to be diversified. More than a third of these gamers, being 39%, have spent on 3 or more of our gaming monetization touchpoints, rising to 60% who have spent across at least 2 monetization touchpoints," end quote. 85% of people who have been playing a game in the age groups of 13 to 34 have purchased a microtransaction. And that's just the people who were saying that they did. Let that sink in for a moment. People voted with their wallet, and they voted that they love to spend money on games that they play. Now, hang on, let's not start pointing pitchforks here. I don't want to villainize the people that spend money on microtransactions. I want to make that crystal clear. It's not a healthy mindset to blame the consumer because that's not who you should be badgering. Instead, you should focus those negative feelings towards the companies that set up these predatory practices in the first place. I don't believe every microtransaction to be predatory, and there are some games that I think that do them right. It's just that the amount of them is very very slim, so there aren't a lot of examples. Dota 2 is a game that I think works really well with the model, as all of the characters you can play in the game are free to everybody. The only thing that costs money are cosmetics. So if you never wanted to buy any cosmetics and just play the game, then you are free to do so. And it even occasionally awards players with cosmetics just by playing normally during events, allowing players who don't have any expendable income to still participate in that system. Warframe is also a game consistently cited as being one of the most fairly monetized free-to-play games on the market. I have not played personally, but from what I understand, the game is very accommodating to free players as long as they have the time and persistence to grind the right materials needed to craft the warframes they want. There's an absurd amount of content to do, and new stuff is getting introduced every year. Both of these are examples of free-to-play games, and not every game can be monetized the same way. But from where I stand, I think generally games that make it cheap to engage with cosmetics and make it so there is still plenty a player can do to grind a currency they might need to unlock something is a decent solution to the problem of making these games sustainable in the long run. I now want to step away from the history and the current state of microtransactions and move into the psychology behind it, and the psychology of why people would spend on things like this in the first place, because I think it's something that might be insightful into the situation as a whole. Spending money and the psychology behind money is one of the most complex things to talk about, which is why oftentimes we see psychologists brought into the gaming industry to make the act of establishing in-game markets and microtransactions much easier. Making systems like this is no easy feat. This is why economists and psychologists are so valued in the gaming space, because they can make games theoretically infinitely scaling products in terms of value. In order to get deeper into why people spend money on microtransactions, we need to ask, what does the spending mean to the average consumer? Now, I'm not going to claim to be a psychology major, but I think it's important to understand the social aspect of what makes spending money on microtransactions so appealing to so many people. In psychology, there is this concept known as self-determination theory. In basic terms, it says that humans need 3 things in order to feel self-determination, or to be filled with purpose, essentially. And those things are as follows: competence, autonomy, and relatedness, or also referred to as connection. People want to feel in control over their lives, so they feel the need to practice all of these things to achieve self-determination. Self-determination is also a way for a person to guide their lifestyle in a more naturalistic manner through extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Gaming is a way to exercise all of the things someone needs to experience self-determination in an accessible format. Gaming satisfies the need for autonomy because they allow the player to have full control over the player character and their actions. They give the player a feeling of competence when they complete challenges posed by the game, and they give the player a sense of connection when sharing the experience with others via multiplayer. Playing games feels good, doesn't it? They make you happy, and people go to games as a way of self-soothing and coping because they occupy all of the basic needs required. However, games are also the perfect place to manipulate susceptible people to spend money, and a lot of it. Let's take a trip back to earlier in the video during the discussion of FIFA and the Ultimate Team and how the game uses loot boxes. In a study titled Play or Pay to Win, Loot Boxes and Gaming Disorder in FIFA Ultimate Team by Jerome S. Lemons, he analyzes the psychological correlation of buying loot boxes in a game and how it relates to self-determination theory. Buying microtransactions, specifically loot boxes, gives the players all the needs they might be searching for. He writes, quote, "Within FIFA Ultimate Team, abbreviated FUT, players can experience autonomy when freely composing their football team. Purchasing loot boxes can meet the need for autonomy because even unwanted players can be sold, providing more financial freedom to acquire desired players on the in-game transfer market. Finally, the need for relatedness describes the experience of meaningful connections with others, which are often experienced through a supportive social environment. Relatedness within FUT could come from feeling part of a community. The purchase of player packs could strengthen the bond with other players because of the prestige they may provide within the community," end quote. People love to spend money to feel connected to themselves and to others. Spending in games allows us to maximize those positive endorphins with as little input as possible, but it's incredibly predatory because these are just temporary solutions to a bigger problem. These issues could be internal negative emotions such as depression and anxiety that don't always have easy solutions. Swiping a credit card is a lot easier than digging deep and actually internalizing and examining our feelings, which is why games are designed in a way they are now. They exploit the player in ways never thought possible. They give the illusion that they can make us feel better, but they continue to alienate the player by mixing them into groups of people who have spent money in order to feel a sense of self-superiority. People also spend money as a byproduct of their environment, and it's noted that people in negative environments are more likely to spend as a coping mechanism. In a study titled Spending as Social and Effective Coping, Measure Development and Initial Validation, which was, funnily enough, conducted before 2020 and the effects of the pandemic became known and spending as a coping mechanism became more seriously recognized. The study theorizes that spending money works as an effective coping mechanism via various factors such as compulsive buying. Alexander Rice et al. State the following, quote, according to the cognitive behavioral model of Kellett and Bolton, compulsive buying is often impulsive and triggered by both environmental cues such as exposure to shopping environments and beliefs that buying can relieve negative effect and provide self-definition. For example, buying may occur when people negatively evaluate themselves and feel inadequate in social environments. Spending under this model is intended to repair negative affect and help people feel more adequate through purchasing products valued in one's social environment, e.g. certain brands of clothing. This model links affective and social coping and is supported by evidence in compulsive and impulsive buying, as well as a link to material values, end quote. Turns out, when people are placed into social environments where they can see other people who have spent money, they have the tendency to feel inadequate. So as a result, they feel the need to spend money as a way to cope with that inadequacy, leading to more compulsive spending, but also giving the buyer a sense of autonomy over their person, one of the main factors of self-determination. Another way for autonomy to be expressed is the desire to spend money on cosmetics that allow the player to dress how they wish and to show others their individuality. On the same study on Ipsos from earlier, Christopher Hoffman also mentions that, quote, personalization/customization and social interaction are critical to video game engagement with P13 through 34 core gamers. In the past 6 months, more than half of these consumers have used a personalized avatar or character, 62%, or chatted with other players while gaming, 56%, end quote. People love spending money on cosmetics. The desire to customize how we look in games satisfies the need to express ourselves to not just ourselves, but to others as well. The psychology of spending money in games is a topic so complex and full of nuance that I don't think I have all of the tools necessary to tackle it in depth in this already long video, but I feel it's necessary to understand that the environments that games provide make it very easy on publishers to implement systems within them that outright manipulate their player bases to spend ludicrous amounts of money by utilizing predatory practices like FOMO, social stigmatization, and the desire to conform with those around us. This is the reason behind the massive push behind live service games as of late. They cultivate spaces where players are around others who spend, and that in turn makes those initial players more likely to spend in order to fit in. It's a huge part of not just social life, but gaming as well. I know many people see gaming as a solitary hobby, but it's no longer just that. Multiplayer is such a vital part of our digital world now. It's a social hobby, and in social situations, we're often pressured into spending in order to fit in. Like if you and your friends go out to eat, it would be weird if you just didn't order anything to eat while everyone else did, right? Or if you went bowling and you just decided to not pick up a ball and just sit in the back. We spend money to socialize, and when we don't spend, it makes it much more difficult to fit in. When we spend money, we are more inclined to stay attached to something because of that sunk cost fallacy. So remember all those 2 million people that played Candy Crush from earlier? They're so deep into the game, both in time and money, that they can never see themselves quitting. It's legitimately an addiction for them. It's very hard to see, but it's the reality of the situation. Like I said, the psychology of spending is a very nuanced topic, so I encourage you to do some research on it outside of this video. Despite everything, gaming is still a hobby, and gaming is one of the pricier ones, but they ultimately are done for enjoyment. I'm sure you and your friends and others you know do it for the same reason. The last thing I want to do is dissuade anyone from enjoying this hobby that I love so much because of this video. That's the least of my intentions. I want it to flourish into something everyone can enjoy, but we also have to come to terms that microtransactions as they are today will be sticking around probably until the end of time. Microtransactions have evolved to the point where I don't think the average consumer has the ability to make any substantial change on the matter because this isn't something we can control anymore. It's too big. The industry has learned that microtransactions work. Despite the constant cries from the media and local governments making appeals to higher powers in an attempt to regulate the gambling and predatory practices that now run rampant, they are outdone and silenced by lobbyists hired by the studios that perpetuate the issue. and more games that practice these predatory microtransactions are making gamers more complacent. Each year, more and more people spend on microtransactions, and it has become normalized to the point where it has become the standard for AAA games to consistently ask for just a little more and a little more on top of that. Microtransactions are ultimately a tool that can be used for good or bad. However, we see it used more frequently for bad than we do for good. Many publishers are using their position in the market to take agency away from players and make them pay more for less, and still not let them own anything at the same time. It's the most disgusting part about gaming today, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon. The people have spoken with their wallets, and the wallets are saying that they are okay with predatory practices, and so it shall be done. More slot for you, and you, and you. And once we, the super cool corporation, say we're done, we'll be taking it all back. You signed the contract, bro. Now you have to live with it. And what's worse, more often than not, when someone purchases a microtransaction, the money spent does not go directly to the dev team that made it in the first place. It doesn't go to the artists, the programmers, the animators, i.e. anyone who made the skins. The money gets funneled straight back into the pockets of the higher-ups who commissioned the skin to be made. They don't care about the artists. All they care about is how well the skin sells. Art is expendable to them. And recently, we've even seen instances where artists are losing their jobs as AI takes over the roles of the creative process, namely 2D artists that work on concept art and graphic design. So not only are the artists making these microtransactions getting shit canned, but the suits up top can profit even more by doing even less. Like, fuck, man. The industry really sucks right now. Microtransactions are the real reason gaming is worse now. I guess, I don't want to be a doomer on the issue because I don't think that's a productive use of energy. Instead, focus on converting that negative energy into something positive. Play games that you enjoy, regardless of whether they have microtransactions or not, because there's no point in ignoring them now. But what I do want you to do is be informed, and I hope this video has helped to get that idea across with how bad the industry has become in recent years because of these things. I'm not a fan of microtransactions, which is why I spend more of my time and money playing indie titles recently, but I am also very much in the minority when it comes to this. With microtransactions flooding the market, I think there's been a bit of a cultural shift with people turning away from them en masse. People seemingly have less expendable income than they used to. The economy is in a hard place, so people would rather turn to products that can give them good experiences for cheap prices without trying to scalp them for a fancy new skin. And I think that's a good thing. It's sending the right messages to publishers. Indies are rising, so as long as more people support games like that, I think those in power will begin to listen a little more closely. If you know someone who bought microtransactions, don't badger them to stop, because it's a fruitless effort. You can't control others. You can only control yourself. So let them know about how dangerous microtransactions are and why. An informed consumer is a good consumer. So if you know you don't like microtransactions and if they make you upset, don't engage with them. It's never worth willingly engaging with something if it makes you upset. Cater your gaming diet to stuff you know you enjoy. We live in a time where there are so many games, both new and old, that have so much to offer outside of $40 skin packs. Hell, they're cheaper too. Keep an open mind and look around for games. Microtransactions never gum up old games, and that's what makes them so magical. But I hope this video gave you more insight into the predatory world of microtransactions. It took me a long time to research, write, record, and edit, so I'm incredibly thankful that you stayed until the end here. Microtransactions are a very deep and complicated topic, so I was bound to miss a thing or three. If I missed something you were thinking about, feel free to leave a comment below about what it was and maybe share what you think. Do you think some games do them better than others? Do you miss the old eras of microtransactions? And maybe while you're down there, click that like and subscribe button. I love making long form video content like this, so those things help spread the video and get the conversation out there even more. Sending out an extra special thank you to my channel members listed here. If you would like to become a channel member yourself and support me doing what I love, you can become a channel member today by clicking the join button down below the video. I'm thinking about making this type of video a yearly update, just so we as a community can get a vibe check on the microtransaction situation with every passing year. It really is something to think about, and I think it would make a great discussion piece going forward. For my next video, I'm definitely going to reel it back because this project was a huge time sink, and I want to talk about something a little more positive, so stay tuned and look forward to it. And as always, this has been Testing Triangles. Thanks for watching.